I started this book, The Age of Anxiety, and I like the quotes from the poets that you cited very well. Actually, this began in one way on 9/11. I had just literally finished my last book about the boom and bust years of the 90s, when everybody in the audience became a dot-com billionaire, and there was only up, not down in the country, and we were invulnerable, impregnable to threats, foreign or domestic, and never had any challenges that would affect us in the world. That ended, pierced all illusions on 9/11. And in the days that followed, I'm from New York, and I'll tell you a little bit about that because it's pertinent to the McCarthy story. I had to go up to New York to see my city. I left about 2 days after the 9/11 calamity, and hailed a cab when I got to Penn Station. You remember the planes were not flying. You had to take the train up. And I got a cab to take me down the West Side Highway. It was a beautiful day, crystal sky, and the smoke was still rising from the 9/11 center into the sky. And as we drove down the West Side Highway, all along the way, there were firemen, rescue workers, lined up, sitting slumped, fatigued, getting water and so forth. And all along the other side were young people cheering, calling them our angels, our heroes. And this was such an incredibly powerful feeling as I went down that until we finally arrived just before you had to turn around where the smoldering wreckage still was there. And I thought to myself, we had reached one of the moments in history where we had turned a corner, and I felt an incredible surge of pride in my fellow Americans, particularly those young people standing out there cheering on those rescue workers. And they were from all over the place, holding bottles of water to pass them across the firemen and the rescue workers. And it seemed to me at that time that we may have passed through the frivolous of the silliness of television and of the 90s, and that we were maybe going to look at some serious questions facing the country, and it may be the dawning of a more mature period in American life. That's what I believed then. I'm afraid that didn't happen, but I felt that very much that day and for weeks to come. And then as the changes began occurring, and we founded the Homeland Security Department, which hardly anyone I knew in Washington thought was really a good idea. It was the Democrats, by the way, that were pushing for the creation of that Homeland Security Department to stitch together 180,000 federal employees of departments. Some of them had been around since the beginning of the Republic, and with independent operations and so forth, into one place seemed an unwieldy and not workable possible organization to fight and make us more secure. But we all hoped that that would work. And then, as you know, we began getting the alerts, yellow, red, orange, and you go along the highways. I'd drive back and forth from Washington to New York, and you'd see spy tips. Call spies. If you have anything that you think is suspicious, call a spy tip number. If you went into a tunnel going to New York or Baltimore, the same thing would occur. And that may have been necessary, but it seemed to me there was bureaucracy gone wild, and it didn't help us create more sense of security. That's the backdrop for this time that I began to look at the changes that occurred in the country. And again, the theme of this book is quite simply what fear does to American life, how it has played over and over again in cycles throughout our history. I go back and recall the Alien Sedition Acts, a great period of similar abuses of power. And it's a terrible period, people thrown in jail unfairly and arrested, and a sense of torment. That was the fear then was republicanism. The French Revolution had just occurred. It was a period of great trauma. Then we went into the Red Scare after World War I, when the Soviet Revolution triumphed, Lenin and Stalin, Trotsky, and America began to reel with the idea we were about to be taken over by Bolsheviks. And we had things like the Parma raids from the Attorney General at the time, and sweeps of people put into jail, and a great deal of really unfortunate events that occurred that time, and we all hope that that was a passing period. And then we went forward into the next period of fear, which is the essence of this book, the Cold War, and Joe McCarthy, and McCarthyism, and the things that happened to American life. And one of the theses of this book is that McCarthyism, Joe McCarthy himself, has been dead for 48 years. But in a way, McCarthyism never ended the tactics of fear, of exploiting fear for cynical political purposes, for attacks of enemy, for dividing us, the same phrases, attacks on education, the elite, attacks on the press, attacks on liberals. Now I hardly know anybody who would admit to being a liberal. It's quite a term of defamation. And also of attacks on who's a good American, who's a bad American, who's a religious American, who's a godless atheist. All of these things are in a direct line from Joe McCarthy. He wasn't the first to employ the articles of fear, but he did it in a way that no one in our history has ever done more successfully and with more power and more lasting effect, to the detriment of the United States, because it turned us from looking seriously at real challenges that did exist, reasons that fear was there, similarly in the age of terrorism, real legitimate reasons for fear of terrorists as there was fear during the age of the bomb. So that was the kind of backdrop of this. But then I want to talk a little bit about, personally, my own background in this process. I never met Joe McCarthy. He had been dead 3 months when I came to Washington in 1957 as a young reporter. I knew in the years then and years since many, many people across the board for a long time who associated with him, who knew him, who were his colleagues in the Senate, staff workers who worked with him, and so forth. And I had a very good sense of the McCarthy story, the legacy, the stories that were told about him. But one of the strange things when I came there that year, Ike was just starting his second term as president. People didn't want to talk about Joe McCarthy 3 months dead. They wanted to turn that page back, hoping that this was an end to a terrible period and that we would go on to a different kind of more sensible, more decent period. That didn't entirely happen either. But so while I didn't know McCarthy, I thought, all the elements of the McCarthy story. I came to Washington after graduate school at the University of Wisconsin in American history, and McCarthy was at that point still a United States senator. And he never dared to take on the university. He attacked scholars across the board, called them communists, subversives, challenged them, hailed them into his committee rooms behind closed doors, browbeat them, as he did in that period. But he never would take on his own University of Wisconsin. He didn't go there. He went to Marquette. But he did make one speech when I was there in graduate school, and I remember it very well. He said, "Even our great University of Wisconsin boasts that it has the greatest collection of communist literature in the world, outside of the Soviet Union. And they use it to show their scholars so they can learn from it," he said with a sneer. The next day, the reporters, obstreperous as always, surrounded the chancellor of the university and asked him, "Is it true what Senator McCarthy said? Do you have all this communist literature?" And the chancellor simply said two things. "Yes, we intend to increase it." And I thought I was in the right place for people to stand up to demagoguery and for independent academic freedom. Before that, before I went to Wisconsin, I was an Army officer for 3 years during the Korean War. And I remember the period vividly, with some emotion, when the Army-McCarthy hearings were going on, and McCarthy was attacking the honor of the Army and attacking its leaders as being part of a nest of subversives and traitors, and accusing valorous people who had bled in World War I, World War II, and even then in Korea because it was going on, of being part of the communist conspiracy and lackeys and jackals of the subversion that was going on, saying they weren't fit to wear the uniform of the United States Army. And the idea within the service, I remember our morale was really shattered, and there was a kind of fear internally. Were we really surrounded by our leaders? And George Marshall, the most revered figure, maybe next to not only Eisenhower owed everything to George Marshall, and I also revered him. Maybe next to George Washington, the greatest military figure, most revered, and in many ways most respected American, as being the architect for 20 years of treason, according to Joe McCarthy. And so that was another aspect that I brought to this topic. Just one more, and this will be the end of the personal biographical essence of how I came to this book. And that occurred when I was in high school in New York City. In 1948, my father was writing a series of articles called Crime on the Waterfront in the old New York Sun. And these articles ran for 24 days, and then 10 more days, and then another 10 days. And they were the first to name what we now call the mafia. He called the syndicate. And he named who they were: the reign of terror, mobsters on the New York waterfront, and a corrupt labor union, the International Longshoremen's Association, and the reign of murders and the fear and intimidation that existed. He named the people: Lucky Luciano, Albert Anastasia, Frank Costello, in the paper every day. And when those articles began running, we began getting a series of telephone calls at home, which I remember quite well, these strange voices threatening to stop those articles or we would be killed. Terrified my mother. My father, with a bit of braggadocio, said what I'm sure he didn't believe: oh, they'll never kill a reporter. But we had an unlisted number for the rest of their lives after that. And the articles went on to win a Pulitzer-prize, and he then sold the rights to Hollywood, which 5 years later became the movie On the Waterfront. That's the background. But what was important about the McCarthy story, this is before McCarthyism even existed. Joe McCarthy was just an obscure freshman senator in 1948, 1949, when these articles were running. And the day they started running, the corrupt president of the union, Joe Ryan, started attacking my father in the press every time he made a speech as being a communist. That the articles are based on communist propaganda, and so forth, every day. And then he tried to get him fired. And then when they sold the rights to Hollywood, hired Bud Schulberg, the screenwriter, and Bud had been a communist in the 30s out of Dartmouth College. If he had been in California, well, he was from California, but that was great. I don't know whether the marble workers in Dartmouth that were in distress, I don't know what the problem was, but he had been. But he completely turned against the Communist Party by the time. But for 5 years, there was a concerted campaign to attack the writer of the screenplay, a commie, and based on the articles by a commie, my father, and they tried to get my father fired and so forth. Happily, he wasn't. And finally, the movie was made. And in the aftermath, the union was the first expelled from the AFL-CIO for racketeering and corrupt, to this day, the only. Joe Ryan went to jail based on the articles and so forth. My father wasn't fired, but that was by then, by the time the movie came out in '54, and actually won the Academy Award in '55. This was the height of the McCarthy period when I was in the service. So I remember that period. I remember it rather well, and I always thought I would at some point maybe go back and recall that period, not so much a personal memoir. It's not a personal memoir, but I do tell those things so readers will understand where I'm coming from. The McCarthy that I thought I knew when I began the research, and I really thought I was engrossed in the McCarthy story. I thought I knew most everything about his tactics and who he was and what he did. But I found the McCarthy period far more formidable, far more compelling, far more dangerous than I ever imagined. He wasn't just a lout, he wasn't just a bully, he was also a genius. Not intellectually. He didn't care about books or ideas. He had a quick mind, and he was very quick at grasping things, but he had a genius for manipulating the press for public opinion, making the charge that reached the headline, and the headline carried the charge, and the backup never quite made it into the papers of the time, or later into the television headline reportage. And this was what McCarthy did for 5 years, leaping from day to day, always escalating his targets, seizing on them, making more and more outlandish charges of communism against the board. Not only Harry Truman and the Democrats, and Red Dean Acheson, as he called him always repeatedly, or the slimy communists within the State Department, or the lackeys in the press of the communist conspiracy. He started attacking Eisenhower's people, and Eisenhower's CIA director. They called him a communist, and so forth. So it went on for 5 years, using the same tactics of employing the press and so forth. McCarthy was he grew up a poor boy in Appleton, Wisconsin, rural, Irish Catholic, 9 children, none of them educated. McCarthy was the first in his family to go to college at Marquette, and he was a tremendously ambitious worker. He wanted to be somebody. He told people at an early age he wanted to be the first Catholic president of the United States. And he started out his political career as an ardent New Dealer, supporting Franklin Roosevelt, and dispensing largesse from the Works Project administration in Wisconsin. And then he switched to the Republican Party, not because he had a change of heart ideologically or politically, but because there was more opportunity for a Republican in the state of Wisconsin, and that's how he shifted his allegiance at the time. McCarthy, there was one thing that I found fascinating, and I don't remember ever reading this in all the accounts during his time on the stage. He told a fellow judge when he was a young judge in Appleton, in his judge chambers, he pulled out a book one day and shocked the judge. He said, "This is the essence of my political strategy." And he held up a copy of Mein Kampf. I'm not making this up. I was startled by this. Never saw it mentioned before or read about it, Mein Kampf. And his defenders later on would say, well, Joe wasn't a Nazi at all, but he would cite that as an example of how to use political philosophy for power. Well, I'm not sure what the difference is, but that was the only book that people can remember him actually citing and reading and so forth, which I found really quite riveting. McCarthy had a kind of strange personality. He could be, by all accounts, one of the most charming people you ever met. Gregarious, full of jokes, backslapping, grab you. You liked him. Female reporters liked him. When he came to Washington, he would give big cookouts and put on an apron and cook for 18 reporters. Then he'd have one for the men and cook out and so forth, and tell them carefully how he worked his way through Marquette as a short order cook, which he did. There was this gregariousness. And he struck a very familiar and friendly relationship with the press in Washington. And they protected him. McCarthy, as I'm sure you know, died tragically at only the age of 47. He died of acute alcoholism. He drank himself to death. He was strapped down for months before he died at Bethesda Naval Hospital with DTs and so forth. And his drinking was legion for years in Washington. There isn't a single word about his behavior in any of the reports in the press of the time. He even kept a flask in the men's room outside his hearing room, where he would go, leave the hearing room, go up there and take the flask, and reporters knew about that, never wrote about it. They protected him. It's the kind of thing that I blush for my business at the time, but that's what happened. There was a familiarity, and they allowed themselves to be used. Not everyone, by any means, but they did allow themselves to be used. And with all of the tactics of McCarthy, it's very important that I explain to you why I think he was successful and rose to be such a powerful force on the American scene. He set out on February 9th, 1950, to give a Lincoln Day address to the Women's Club of Ohio County in Wheeling, West Virginia. 200 women in a state that had voted Democratic for the last 5 elections, including Harry Truman's 2 years before. At the time he set out, and he was one of countless Republicans sent out by their party to give Lincoln Day addresses and set the theme for the Republican campaign strategy of that year, which had been announced 2 days before he left, which was that the Democrats were soft on communism, I'm quoting, and they allowed the government to be infested by communists. Those were McCarthy's themes. He wasn't the only one that used them, but he employed them in a way more effectively, more brilliantly, more boldly, more demagogically than anyone ever, and he made a difference. He went out to Wheeling at that point, sort of a fellow who was afraid he was about to lose his seat, just that he won 4 years before. He was up in 1952. He had an undistinguished record. The Republicans didn't like him. He turned on them in the Senate. The Democrats shunned him, and he was sinking in the opinion polls in Wisconsin. And he was looking for an issue. And he goes to Wheeling, West Virginia, in a remarkable moment, and I think what will be seen as the most infamous speech in American political history. And he strides across the ballroom waving a sheaf of papers. And he says, I have here in my hand a list of 205 communists who are at this moment members of a spy ring actively shaping and directing the foreign policy of the United States in the State Department. He had the list in his hand. There was no list. There were no names. It was all made up out of absolute whole cloth. And he waved these figures in a way that, and of course it got the headlines. Where the list came from, not the list, but where the numbers came from, was something 4 years before, in 1946, a Republican congressman from Illinois had asked about the loyalty of Americans coming back from World War II, then in the government, and there was a list of possible disloyal people, and a number of which arrived at 205, and even of that, only about 1/3 was still even then on the government payroll, and none of them, there were no names, and none even mentioned they were communists or spies or traitors. And that letter from the congressman to the Secretary of State, Jim Burns at the time, was where McCarthy drew his material. And McCarthy claimed, as he always did, that he had just discovered this absolutely perfidious information, this incendiary, seditious information. In fact, the congressman had put it in the congressional record 4 years before. So it was a public document, and there were no names, no lists. But McCarthy seized on that in a way that was quite brilliant. If the Times had not created the opportunity for him, he never would have succeeded. But by a series of fortuitous events that happened just as he was about to give that speech in Wheeling, the Times were right for a demagogue. Just a few days before, Alger Hiss had been convicted of perjury, not treason, but perjury, in the most famous espionage case in American history. And I think there's no doubt that he was a spy. He was giving aid to the Russians. The Venona documents seem to prove that, even though there's some controversy to this day. In London, just a couple of days before McCarthy landed in Wheeling, page 1 banners said that someone named Claus Fuchs had been arrested by the FBI in London, charged with espionage and treason. He was a British subject of German extraction who had worked during the war on the Manhattan Project, and he did indeed give atomic secrets to the Soviet espionage agents. So that was another factor. In Asia, Mao's forces had succeeded in driving Chiang's nationalist forces out of the mainland into the China Sea, East China Sea, into what is now the island of Taiwan, then Formosa, and they instantly signed a pact with the Soviet Union, putting the two great communist powers together in an explosive danger to the United States. And literally days before that event, the Chinese had expelled all American emissaries from China. The Korean War, which I then sometime later served in, was only 3 months away. And if that wasn't enough, the Berlin Wall had not gone up. Well, yeah, had gone up, but we were trying to penetrate, and Berlin was a tinderbox. We had flown the missions across to liberate or feed humanitarianly the Berliners, but we had not ended the idea that the tinderbox of war was about to explode at any minute. And in that context, Harry Truman announced that we were embarking on the greatest and most powerful weapon yet, the development of the hydrogen bomb, far more dangerous than the atomic bomb. So all of these fears were brewing in the background. And then in that moment, it's just fascinating. I went back and put all this stuff together. Albert Einstein went on national television, just black and white, then in its infancy, the father of the nuclear age, and he looked into the camera and he said, "We have reached the point in human history where the extinction of the human species is possible." And then he beckoned his finger. Incendiary extinction beckons, unless we dealt with the threat of nuclear weapons. So that was the explosive material that rested there when Joe McCarthy went out to Wheeling and started 5 years of what we now know as McCarthyism, a dictionary term in the dictionary that means simply false accusations of disloyalty, guilt by association, character assassination, and use of investigatory techniques to bring down critics unfairly. That's what McCarthyism is in the dictionary. Nobody else really has given their name to an age. Joe McCarthy did. McCarthy, there's not much humor in the McCarthy story, but the one moment that I wish I had been there, I wish I had covered that story. McCarthy set out the very next morning from Wheeling to give another round of speeches. And he ranked so low in the Republican hierarchy that he had to beg to make these speeches, and they sent him to way out of the way places like Wheeling and Huron, South Dakota, and Las Vegas and Reno, Nevada, where the big hitters of the party were going to places, maybe San Diego, I don't know, and, but they were all over the country, and not Joe McCarthy, who was Joe McCarthy. But after that first night, Joe McCarthy suddenly, through the press, catapulted his name ahead of all those then exploiting the issue and fear of communism. And he flew out of Wheeling, and there was a huge banner in the headline of the paper. Looking at the papers, you're just filled with threats and fears and so forth in this little West Virginia town. So when he flew out of Wheeling, he saw the paper, huge banner headline, McCarthy charges Reds infiltrate State Department. His next stop was simply an airport stop at Denver's Stapleton Airport. And by then, the State Department had issued a flat denial to these charges, said McCarthy should come forward with any charges, any documentation of his charges is simply untrue. And then the reporters, this time, gathered around him on the tarmac at Stapleton Airport, and here was the only humorous event in the whole story. He had gone off alone with a bulging briefcase full of material that he used then for 5 years. He'd always searched through his briefcase to pull out supposedly incriminating documents. And he'd say, I'd show it to you now, but he'd never show them to you. Literally, that's literally what happened. And he's there on the tarmac of Wheeling, rummaging through, and the reporter said, Senator, show us the list. Who are the names? Who are the traitors? Who are these spies? You have the list. And he rummaged, he kept rummaging. He finally said, I left the list and the baggage on my plane. And the Denver Post took a picture, and they ran this picture on page 1 the next morning of Senator McCarthy rummaging through his briefcase. And the caption said, left commie list on bag on plane. And then he was off again. And typically, he didn't stop with the State Department. Now he attacked Dean Acheson, and now he attacked Harry Truman by the time he got to Reno. And so this whole thing began to escalate and escalate and escalate. And by the time he arrived back in Washington, after a period of only 10 days, he stopped off in Milwaukee, his home state, and he had a private lunch with the editors of the Milwaukee Journal, then very much opposed to McCarthy, very critical of his tactics even then. And two of the reporters said, well, Senator, show us, Joe, they said, it wasn't Joe, show us the list. What about this? What about these charges? We want to see the list. He said, oh, that's just, this is off the record. He said, that was just a speech to a bunch of Republican women. It wasn't. He was cavalier. It wasn't serious. It was just, and then he was off again. But they never wrote that. They never wrote what he said. And this happened again and again and again in the McCarthy story. So by the time he arrived back in Washington, all of a sudden, he was, in fact, dominating the news, tying up the Senate, using the tactics of charge and smear, and pretending to have documents that showed a dramatic, exclusive proof of traitors. And the thing about McCarthy, the genius was, while people were talking about traitors, enemies with N, and so forth, only McCarthy claimed to have their names. He had a list. He knew who they were. He knew where they were. And in fact, so would Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, know, or could find out, and Harry Truman could find out, unless they were traitors themselves. That was the kind of technique that he employed in that period. And it worked. The 3.5 weeks after Wheeling, Herb Bloch, the cartoonist at the Washington Post, who Herb did have a genius, and it was someone I loved very much and admired. Herb Bloch drew a cartoon just 3.5 weeks after Wheeling. I put it in the book. I got it. And it shows a Republican, a very reluctant Republican elephant, being pushed by Republican leaders toward a whole pile, a pedestal of tar buckets, dripping with tar and tar brushes. And the elephant says, do you mean I have to stand on that? And at the very top bucket, Herb drew one word, McCarthyism. He defined the era 3.5 weeks after McCarthy's speech. And I dedicated this book to Herb because he had that sense of understanding. He was a great civil libertarian, born in Chicago, a Republican and so forth. Cartoons on Hitler and Stalin are among the best in American cartooning in the late 20s and 30s into the 40s. But he was very, very strong about that. So I dedicated the book to Herb. The problem with Joe McCarthy, the lessons of it as he went on, even then it wouldn't have worked had he not been able to demonstrate and seize fear and gain political power. By 1952, he campaigned across the country on behalf of using the communist brush to target Democratic senators. And he is credited with electing 8 Republican senators, or defeating 8 Democratic senators, including the majority leader of the Senate. And at that point, all of a sudden, the Democrats who had disdain and had contempt for McCarthy and thought he wasn't really going to last long, were seized with a sense of fear of taking on Joe McCarthy. And one Democratic senator said to another at that time, "For whom does the bell toll?" And then pointed, it tolls for thee." They didn't take on Joe McCarthy at that point, really at all. Hardly anybody did. And the Republican Party was also divided in fear. Half of them had contempt, others used McCarthy. So it was not an accurate time for heroism or courage on either part of either party. The most wonderful thing that happened in that period was a speech by a senator. You may remember or not, you should know about it. It was the single best speech of my life. The one really true profile in courage by a woman named Margaret Chase Smith of Maine. She was a backbencher, very moderate, Republican, no bomb thrower. She started out, she was the first woman elected to the United States Senate. Her husband had been a congressman, and he died, and she succeeded him, so she was the first ever to be a member of the House and then the Senate. But she was very, very retiring and so forth. And she started out liking Joe McCarthy and thinking he was onto something. And so did the people, by the way. The people who heard these things said, you know, it can't be, there must be something there. This is the United States Senator. He was a Marine veteran of World War II. Although he falsified his record in Tail Gunner Joe, there's a whole series about that. I documented. But they believed that there must be something there. You wouldn't make these kinds of charges. Nobody would sink that low. And Margaret Chase Smith started out believing that. And then the more she watched Joe moving on and making these charges, didn't make sense to her. And then she finally, with a wonderful Yankee independence, she finally thought he was wrong and he was doing a great disservice to the country and was actually falsifying and making false charges and using the cloak of the Senate to protect himself from libel suits, because you have immunity to make these charges. And she gave a speech called A Declaration of Conscience. I quote a great bit of it. It's the most wonderful thing you've ever heard. And it was singly, quietly, and passionately made the case about fear and damage to institutions, damage to Americans, damage to all of it. I'm not going to read it to you now. It's here. If you ever read the book, it's in there. And if there's nothing else you read Margaret Chase Smith's speech. And she got 6 other Republican moderates to sign on with the speech. And they all surrounded her and cheered her in this wonderful, truly independent. She criticized the Democrats. She criticized the threat of communism. I mean, she acknowledged and all that there was reason to be free, but not the tactics employed by Joe McCarthy. And within a month or two, all 6 of the other senators had stopped supporting her, because by then McCarthy kept rising in power. And his typical response was he was asked, "What do you think about her speech, Senator?" And he dismissed it with a sneer. It was Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. That's what he called them, and that was the end of that. The tragedy of McCarthy and the great lesson for our time, and how it echoes today, is how many decent people, honorable people, allowed themselves to be intimidated, did not stand up, demand for accountability, challenge in old-fashioned American virtues. And that was true on both sides of the party aisles. Democrats kept saying Lyndon Johnson was then the majority leader. He took, after McFarland had been defeated by McCarthy, he became the majority leader, the strongest, most effective majority leader ever in our history. And he kept being implored by his allies and others and FDR aides in the past to take on McCarthy. He's dangerous, he's running America. And Lyndon would say, if I did that, I'd make him even more powerful. The time isn't right. And he said, besides, he's a Republican problem, not a Democratic problem. Fact is, he was an American problem. And in many ways, the Republican Party did the same. I want to tell you something that I learned in this book, and I find it sort of, for what it's worth, I still am stunned by it. When I came to Washington as this young reporter, I guess I was pretty cocky and brash and thought I was pretty smart and tough-minded and all that. And Ike being in the second term, then the oldest president ever, I thought Ike was kind of a bumbling dodo. He now looks terrific to me. I mean, but there's a tragedy about Ike. The more I look at the portrait of Ike, the Ike's use of the way he would use or not use power, his decency, his instincts, all of the things that made him who he was, and the reputation that he had honorably. And when he became the president, the first Republican president since Hoover, after all, after the New Deal years, and he had the chance to shape a new country and a new leadership and a new party, and he despised Joe McCarthy. And McCarthy was attacking his State Department now. His people, George Marshall, all these people across the board, the CIA, and turning on them, accusing them of being nests of communists and the rest. And Ike would, his brother Milton, whom Ike admired more than anybody alive and respected his advice enormously, kept imploring, writing, calling Ike, do something about McCarthy, stop him, he's ruining America, you've got to do it. And Ike would say, I'm not going to get down in the gutter with that guy. That was his response. What really changed I'm stunned by this. He started dictating to Ann Whitman, his secretary in the Oval Office. And the diaries are in the Eisenhower Library. And they are remarkable. He starts fulminating about McCarthy over and over again. He wants to be president. He never will be if I have anything to do with it. If he keeps on this way, I will leave the Republican Party and try to form a new party in the sensible middle of American life. And I thought, yeah, that's what we want. Not left, not right, not liberal, not conservative, really put together the heart of the country. And he said this several times. I will leave the Republican Party and so forth. So they keep attacking and keep attacking and keep attacking. The tragedy was he never did. And he did make statements from time to time that were noble about the instincts. Don't join the book burners when terrible things were going on in the McCarthy period. And I say in the book, if only he had made an Edward R. Murrow kind of speech to the country with his great prestige and simply said, we have to stop this. This is not America. This is not what we believe in. And he didn't do that. He always believed that in the end, McCarthy would destroy himself and the American people would see him for who he was. And that he was right in that sense. He did destroy himself, but 4 years went on and damage was done. So I now think of Ike as a very great president, measured and all, wise beyond, I wish we had him now. You got to understand, coming from me, that's big stuff. And all that, but he never took on McCarthy until the end. At the end, he did mobilize behind the scenes to help bring McCarthy down at the end. But he didn't take him on publicly, ever. And one of the people I interviewed, a very great man named General Andrew Goodpasture, who was very close to Ike in the White House. At the time, he became later the head of NATO and Europe, and the head of the War College, head of Commandant of West Point. And I interviewed him, a wonderful man. He died just before the book was published at the age of 90. And Goodpasture would describe to me in vivid, he had also worked for Marshall, worshiped Marshall, as Eisenhower did. And he would describe to me how Ike would talk to him in the Oval Office about McCarthy. And Ike had a furious temper that you never saw from the, kind of rigid, sort of laid back, seemingly performance that he had. And he would talk about McCarthy. As he talked, his face would flush and the blood would raise right up to his hair roots. And he'd keep saying, I'll never get down the gutter with that guy. Well, he didn't, but it lasted a long time. And by the way, about the Ed Murrow, you mentioned the Ed Murrow movie. I'm not here making a speech for for George Clooney, he can speak for himself rather well. The movie is a great movie, and I hope you see it. If you haven't, I really hope you do. And I was very flattered and very privileged 2 weeks ago on Friday night in New York City to be invited by the Foreign Relations, Council on Foreign Relations, to be there when Clooney premiered his movie before a great audience there at the Museum of Broadcasting, sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations. And they had invited me some months before, would I come there with my book and I could talk with Clooney after the movie was shown. I said, yeah, I might do that, you know, I might be willing to do that. And so we after the movie went on and I saw it, and Jeff Greenfield interviewed the two of us for about an hour. And it's a great movie, but what's wonderful about it, if people think there was a lot of mystique and misinformation about what McCarthyism is, there wasn't damage. What Clooney does in the movie, instead of having an actor play Joe McCarthy, you actually see McCarthy. And you see him again and again. And if you've never seen Joe McCarthy, this is worth the price of everything. No writer could capture that face, that glowering look, that ominous, threatening sound, that monotone. Do you mean to tell me, Senator? Do you mean to tell me, General? Do you mean you're not fit to wear the you communist lackey? And it's just unbelievable. It's hard to believe it happened, but it's terrifying to see it. So particularly the young people, the students in the audience at the very least, I hope you see the movie. I did tell Clooney, I admired the movie enormously, but I did say, you've created a myth, because you've made it seem now, to all time, that Joe McCarthy was brought down by Ed Murrow, and that is not true. McCarthy was in the process of implosion at that point. 4 years had gone by. Murrow didn't speak out for 4 years. Many people had by then. The Republicans had turned against him. The Democrats had turned against him. His popularity was sinking very badly. He was imploding. And the Army McCarthy hearings, where he made his fatal mistake to take on the Army as being a nest of spies and communists, was only 1 month away. And McCarthy, that's what brought him down in all those circumstances, and I could mobilize behind the scenes and so forth. But the Murrow movie, the Murrow portrayal in this thing is a great lesson for the press, because that's what the press ought to do. It shouldn't be a cheerleader. It ought to be a critic. It ought to raise questions. It ought to hold people accountable. That's what we haven't done, and that's what Ed Murrow, and I don't want to take one little laurel out of Ed Murrow's great, but he didn't bring down, and great and eloquent, but that's the lesson. That's a great lesson for today's journalists. So the McCarthy story ends in a tragedy, human tragedy. Only 47 years old. He dies at alcoholism, having nightmares of snakes attacking him in the night, paranoid, going to his door with a gun in his hand, thinking that his rooms were bugged and so forth. None of that was reported at the time, and very young. So there is this human tragedy about Joe McCarthy, the person who destroyed himself in the end. And I think this is not a psychological portrait. Somebody could do a wonderful book on that, I'm sure. I did not do this, but the portrait of McCarthy intrigues me, because as he started out, he was completely cynical. He didn't really care about what he was saying. He used it to gain power, and it was a cynical game in many ways for him. But as he went on, as he grew more power accreted to him, and he became this frightening force in American life, he began to believe in himself, and he began speaking of himself in the third person. In the hearings and testimony, thereafter McCarthy, I'm not going to let them, you're not going to let them get down, as if he was an ism himself. And he began to believe in that, and he kept lifting him up and up and up, and finally his ego soared, and I think those factors, along with finally the censure that brought him down. And there's another little thing I had forgotten. I'll just pass it on. I don't want to keep you here too long. But when the final censure of Joe McCarthy came about on the floor of the United States Senate, after the McCarthy hearings in the summer of 1954, they finally had a debate. Lyndon Johnson finally came forward at the end and acknowledged publicly he was against Joe McCarthy. The president had put his own people on the line. The very first senator who spoke to register his vote and call for the censure of Joe McCarthy was someone named Prescott Bush of Connecticut, the father of George H.W. Bush, the grandfather of W. And he gave a wonderful, eloquent, noble speech. I found that very interesting. And the final vote, which foreshadowed a lot of the changes which were to come, all the Democrats voted to censure Joe McCarthy, with one exception. Jack Kennedy didn't vote. He had the back operation, but he could have paired himself for a vote, never did. He was very close to McCarthy. His father was so close to him. That's a whole other story. Fascinating story. But every single of the Republicans who did vote, they've split right down the middle. 22 voted to censure Joe McCarthy, and 22 voted to support him and said it was a witch hunt. Those 22 senators, people like Prescott Bush and the Rockefellers and so forth and so on, those 22 were the old, progressive, Eastern, Midwestern, old Theodore Roosevelt wing of the Republican Party, which really doesn't much exist now. And we are more polarized in the aftermath of that period. I just offer that as looking back on it. The last part of my book, I draw a lot of lessons between now and then, what I call parallels and lessons between the McCarthy era. How the tactics of McCarthy have been employed not just by Republicans, but hitmen over and over again, using fear to exploit and divide us and ignite us and frighten us and turn Americans against Americans. And there are lots of examples in here, from the Patriot Act on through prison abuses that I find appalling, enraging, that happened on American soil first, not just in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, that I can't imagine how it happened in the military, and it also happened at home right after 9/11 that the public isn't aware of much. I began this book, I wrote the prologue for the book as we were invading Iraq in March of 2003. And I have not changed a word of what I wrote then, and I raised questions about that event. I was all for the president's move into Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden. By the way, where is he? To get Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And I had the feeling at the time, I feared that the move to Iraq could be calamitous, and it was, at the very least, was something that could echo throughout our history and would be seen as a very disastrous potential event with ramifications yet to come long in the future. So, and I end with some thoughts about Iraq. I noticed tonight, just before I came here, we hit the 2,000 mark of American deaths in Iraq, 15,000 casualties, and I don't know how many Iraqis, but the one tragedy is, I think we could all agree, I hope, is that we are not more secure from enemies abroad. We're not safer at home or abroad from terrorism. I think we've ignited more terrorists, not less. And I think also the shocking example of Katrina and the inability of the government and the Homeland Security Department to actively, effectively protect the United States suggests that we have a huge amount of work to do to make ourselves as secure as we could be. The theme of the book is fear. How it can be exploited, how fear legitimately does exist, and how the challenge of a democracy is to strike the balance. When I write my books, I always try to find one thematic quote at the beginning that expresses what I think is the theme of the book. This one begins with a quote from Mr. Lincoln, who's not bad to quote at any time on any subject. And this is what Mr. Lincoln said: "Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its people, or too weak to maintain its own existence?" And that conflict, that dilemma between the need for security to protect ourselves from enemies, foreign and domestic, and calamities natural, is at the essence of a free society and our society. At the same time, the essence also is that we must not allow it to be misused, power accreted and abused, so that we lose our liberties unfairly and wind up destroying who we are and become more like the enemies we combat. That's not a new dilemma. That has been around since the Alien Sedition Acts, the Red Scare and then the McCarthy period and the bomb, now in the age of terrorism. It's the hardest thing this democratic, small d society has to grapple with. And it's not just a question for its leaders or its press or its political people, although it is certainly for them. It's also for all of us as citizens, because in the end, we have the final word if we choose to exercise it. Thank you very much.